think a lot of people wouldn't like the sound of that, that then, oh, your world becomes less real in some sense. And in some way, I mean, I can actually relate to that sentiment. There is this sort of sense of like, it's not what it used to be. I mean, the world is certainly not what it used to be for me. And in some way, it's less real in the way that before there was a really taken in by a framing that the world is like this really hard, concrete, physical, static structure, and now everything's much lighter and airier and moving and flowing. How can you how do you sell that to people that it's worth them sort of de-reifying their world?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to give just a brief overview of predictive processing. So predictive processing starts with the understanding that the brain needs to solve the problem of perception. That's what it's known as in philosophy. And this problem involves not having direct access to the world. So the brain has to understand that world based on sensory data acquired through the body-based senses. And it can only access this data and nothing else. So it has to model the world to make sense of it. And it does this so that it can act effectively in that world, i.e., avoid dying. So here we're using the word world loosely. And what we really mean is that the brain has to model the sensory environment it finds itself in, including all bodily signals as well. And to do this, it needs to construct what we phenomenally experience by modeling the world, the body, and the self. And this model must be generated on the inside, based on past experience, both from our genetic history, as well as our developmental process and experiences in the world. So how does the brain generate a useful model of the world while never being in direct contact with it? It does this by making predictions about the causes of sensory input. And to do so, it engages in perceptual inference, where it compares its predictions to the sensory input. And it updates its hypotheses about the world based on the difference between the predictions and the input. And this difference is called prediction error. Here in the image on the right, you can see the famous duck rabbit. So at a higher level of abstraction, the brain is either making the prediction that you are looking at a duck or that you're looking at a rabbit. However, at a lower level of abstraction, lower down the brain's model, its hierarchical model, you're perceiving lines, curves, textures, and basic shapes that don't change depending on how one looks at the image. So now let's talk a little bit about attention. So an agent's confidence in a prediction is known in predictive processing as precision. And precision is analogous to attention. And precision weighting is the process by which an agent decides what to pay attention to. So on the right, you'll see two images of the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And the one on the left has higher precision and also a better signal to noise ratio. And the one on the right has lower precision and more noise. So you'll notice that attention will tend to be drawn to the one on the left because it's more informative than the one on the right. Now, active inference and action policies. So there's a second way to reduce prediction error, and that is through active inference. So this is done by changing the sensory input rather than updating the model. And you do this by engaging the body in movement in order to achieve the input you want to get. So what is referred to as an action policy is an extension of active inference. And it's a sequence of actions which take an agent from the current sensory state to a sensory state they expect to be in. And action policies can be entirely or partially made up of mental actions. Finally, what is a mental action? So a mental action is the broadcasting of predictions of precision to lower levels, where these predictions constrain and select ascending prediction errors. And this is somewhat analogous to introspective attention. And something is a mental action only if the precision weighting is deployed top-down rather than locally. And that is it for this brief overview.
So, where do we begin this talk?
I think an interesting place to actually start it would just, if we can try and break down concentration and insight practice into what I think is going on there in terms of predictive processing.
Sounds good.
So there's this thing where when people talk about concentration practice and meditation, it's often somewhat confused, I think. Where it's like, because people are like, yeah, it's like your ability to stay focused on the thing, but it's also like a state that you get progressively deeper into. And I think, I mean, maybe someone has explained this already in a much better way somewhere else, but my way of thinking about it is that there is what we can call mindfulness, but you could also call meta-awareness. And it's basically just you're focusing on an object while you're meditating. And then you get distracted and you realize you're distracted and you go back to the object again. Now, how quickly you can notice you're distracted is like one metric of concentration. So if you're super good, the moment you notice you notice really quick, you're distracted, like only milliseconds after you actually were distracted from the object, then that's one thing. But there's another thing that is the stickiness of all meditation objects is becoming less over time. Now, in terms of predictive processing, you can think of the first one as just how quickly you return to the thing. And you can think of the second part in terms of precision weighting. So precision weighting is this thing in predictive processing where this is where I can't do it without this
well, it's like how much saliency is given to particular content of interest and how
in relation to other
it has to be in
content.
relation, because there's always this competitive nature where there's multiple things competing for your limited attention. But what's really important to focus on. I mean, one thing that I hope actually predictive processing can just give a more sophisticated framework to meditation is, it seems in the meditation world there's quite this simplistic understanding of attention, concentration. A lot of people who say they can't meditate when they try because they like focusing on the breath, and they notice all this other mind stuff going on, and they think they have to, from the get-go, get to a point where there's only the breath and nothing else happening in the world that they're aware of. Then there's this sort of model inspired by TMI of attention versus peripheral awareness, which kind of actually, that sets a better scene in some way. It's still simplistic, but it's a little bit better to let meditators know, it's okay if you're still noticing thoughts in the background and you can still feel your body and you still know that it's a Wednesday or whatever, in the back of your mind. But as long as you're holding, the breath as your main object, and there's something to be said about, if you lose the breath as your object from not just attention but awareness itself completely, because you're totally in dreamland, and that's a higher degree of distraction than if it simply slipped from attention to a peripheral awareness, where you're still kind of tracking it, and then maybe you bring it back into focus and you can retroactively log that, yeah, okay, 3 breaths passed, as opposed to come to like, oh, I don't know how long I was breathing for, or I can just suddenly it's just appearing again.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like you can think of it like there's a type of, if you go back to precision weighting and you assign like a numerical value of salience to each possible thing that could occupy your mind at a given moment, then your mind is maybe, the breath is a really highly salient object when you initially direct attention to it, of course. But then over time, it's like decreasing, it's going down, and the conversation you had with your friend last Wednesday is going up, going up, going up. And at some point, it crosses over, and your attention will move to the conversation you had with your friend. Now, the thing is that if you're not a meditator and your things are sticky, this, I think, will keep moving up much, much, much higher, and the breath is going to completely lose, comparatively, all precision. So this is going to end up super high and this is going to end up super low. But if you're like quite a good meditator, then although you're having this conversation happen, the breath is still kind of at a comparatively strong level. So then for it to come back into attention, it just needs like a little bit. So because of this, you can get this thing where, yeah, you're focusing on the breath, but then the conversation comes back into your mind, and you get kind of like this thing going on, where you got one, and then you got the other, one and the other, but you're still sort of like meditating on the breath, just with like a bunch of constantly punctuating distractions, basically.
You talk about, okay, stickiness. So why rather than saying if you're a meditator or not, like it's a binary, you can sort of say a spectrum, and sort of, the more you practice, the better this gets. But what is happening there? Why are distractions becoming less sticky? And you would think, why do meditators have a better hold on what they want to point attention at? This ability to set an intention and stick to that intention. You can have this kind of brief thought at the beginning of the meditation. Okay, for the next hour, I want to focus on the breath, and that just sets the ball rolling. And the more you meditate, the more skilled you get at this. That little intention setting just holds out for longer and longer.
Yeah. So in a way, you can think of you're setting that. Well, let's take again, sort of like the non-meditator sets that intention. The precision goes super high on the breath, but then it's going to start. How can I say this? It's going to start dropping down, and I mean, I guess like my way of answering that is sort of what I said before in a way, because it's just, you can keep attention more or less on the breath as long as nothing is super grabby on your attention, nothing else that pops up like that. So as long as your thoughts about what you should do, the pain in your back, like whatever, all of that stuff is not particularly strong in attention, then it's not going to like eclipse the meditation object that you already had there.
But what are we training so that that precision weighting isn't being off balanced all the time?
Yeah, so every time you notice you are distracted to some degree, but you don't actually engage with that distraction. You are training your brain, in a sense, to not assign high precision to that thing. Oh. You're kind of being like, no, don't actually pay attention to that. Don't go into that like mind wandering episode. Or you feel the impulse to get up and move, and you're saying to your brain, no, don't actually do that. And if you keep doing that, then the brain kind of learns like, oh, okay, maybe it's not that big a deal if I don't get up right now.
Yeah.
And that's actually how you start dropping down the precision on kind of the distractors.
Well, that's interesting, because at the early stages of meditation, a lot of distractions arise. Just a lot of itching, a lot of thinking, a lot of urges, a lot of numbness in the legs. But then as you meditate longer and longer, those distractions just actually stop popping up altogether, I guess, because your brain is learning. It's like, okay, he's in meditation mode, and we know that's actually a safe mode to be in, maybe even quite like homogenizing or healthy, so we're gonna let him do this activity.
Yeah, I think in a way it's something like the brain knows that you're engaging in actually what is a high relevance task for it, rather than engaging in something that makes no sense.
Yes, meditation makes no sense in the beginning. It's like it's seemingly the most like unevolutionarily beneficial activity to kind of stop and sort of exclude your awareness from your environment and just be super still and very vulnerable. That's a funny sort of explanation.
It's like your brain is basically, it's continuously trying to solve problems, either to increase its comfort or to increase its knowledge, to in the long term increase its comfort, and not just comfort but survivability. So it's constantly trying to solve problems, and its normal mode is every single second that you are awake, your brain is trying to address what are the most important problems to keep you alive.
Well, there's also this framing that we're constantly trying to strive for homeostasis. And it's pretty evident that a lot of what we do in day-to-day life doesn't get us there. We're always sort of creating stresses that then stick on us and then carry throughout the week, and always trying to feed our hunger and satiate our sleep and all these things. But when you meditate a lot, you come really, really close to homeostasis. Like it's the most efficient. You kind of become this like cold-blooded reptile in some way, and you just sort of stay, and your body temperature can lower, and your in-breath and your out-breath equalize, and the heart rate slows down. So by that mode you would think it's a very energy efficient mode for humans to discover, and yet it's not intuitive to us.
I think part of that's to do with modern living, but I think a lot of that actually has to do with kind of like stressors and cortisol and stuff like that. So the average person has high degrees of anxiety about things that are going to come next in their existence. They have high degrees of, so there are all these problems. They're not immediate problems, though. They're not like, I'm thirsty, I need a glass of water, let's move my body to get one. They're, next week I'm going to have a conversation with my boss, and, it's going to be an issue for me.
Maybe we could talk about this in the context of predictive processing. What's that Thoreau quote? It's like, most men live in constant fear of things that seldom happen, or something like this.
I like that.
Where most of our worries come from anticipation of something bad happening that, when it comes, is actually not as bad as you think, or it doesn't actually ever happen like that, and if you just pay attention, you're like mostly pretty good. But to the untrained mind, it's you take these predictive models really seriously. There's a lot of reality sort of injected into them. This is going to happen. This is a very likelihood. It's almost like it is happening to me now. The body physiologically reacts like, oh, I am actually giving this presentation in front of everyone, and what if I'm naked and I forget my words, and it takes it as real. But what I found is the more I meditate, the brain can still be conjuring up these hypotheticals and making calculations about, okay, what is likely to happen or not, or what do I need to plan for. But there's less delusion. They're known to be fabrications and just just predictive model. I mean, really just thoughts.
Yeah, and they don't. The thing is, they don't actually optimize survival anymore. I mean, when I think there was a fitness payoff when you're thinking, is my home safe? Is my shelter safe, or is it as such that some sort of animal can come here and maybe not even eat me, but steal all my food? And like, that's a legitimate thing to think about for your own survival. So maybe, although it sucks as a way of existing, maybe having really high anxiety levels a lot of the time in situations where you're likely to die and life is quite precarious, it makes a lot more sense than in a modern world where all of those concerns are pretty much not going to happen. And the ones that actually might happen, like getting hit by a car or something, are not what anyone is concerned about anyways.
There's like a mismatch. Ironically, total mismatches here. Just to circle back, you mentioned meta-awareness. What's that?
Yeah, so there's kind of different ways. The way people talk about meta-awareness, it depends on who's talking about it. There's terms like meta-awareness and metacognition, and I'm going to use meta-awareness in a very specific way, and that it is basically, if you have an intention to focus on something, how quickly, once you get distracted, are you going to get back to what you were intending to focus on? So it's sort of like there's a process where you are focusing on an object and your attention is there. And then you get distracted, but you haven't realized you've got distracted yet. Your mind is somewhere else and you just haven't realized it. And how quickly you realize your distracted state is what I'm referring to as meta-awareness.
And does this sort of build the, as you say, like the temporal depth window, widens it through meditation? Because it used to be the case for me that, like I couldn't kind of see too far behind me and too far ahead of me when meditating. Is like I had these like much more myopic vision, focusing on the breath, and that meant that if any kind of distraction came careening into my mind, it totally took me, and I didn't see it coming. It blindsides me. But then with maybe more meta-awareness, you do have this. I don't necessarily want to invoke like a spatial sort of zooming out view to people get this sense of like, oh, the witness back here. But for the sake of language, I'll just say, you get the zoomed out perspective with your awareness, at least, and you can kind of notice distractions incoming and kind of go, that's going to be a potential distraction. I can like preemptively ignore that and stay on my object. And also then I found over time there's less of this like gestalty switches where I was like totally gone and then I snap back. There's everything's so much smoother and sort of fading into from one thing, one particular phenomenon to notice to another thing, and then maybe that's not the thing, and I kind of glide back, but I always kind of saw both of them coming and going, as opposed to this sort of really sort of fixed in myopic view of this and this and then this and then where am I, and then where is the object? Like I've lost it, and then I need to kind of zoom in. Like
nice. So that's the mind operating, assigning really high precision to everything.
To everything.
It's funny because even though you're meditating on the breath, I would actually assert that a meditator that's actually quite adept is going to be, they're not assigning full precision to the meditation object. They're assigning somewhat less than full precision there because they need to actually, they want their attention to like kind of monitor those other just potential distractors so that they can do something about them. So it's kind of, I guess, to talk about it in terms of kind of like contraction, let's say, it's like the beginner meditator will fully, when they start focusing on the breath, they're going to fully contract around perceiving the breath. And that's what they're doing. And they have nothing left to actually focus on anything else. But then the next thing comes in and they're completely unprepared for it. And then they're suddenly in mind wandering or whatever. Whereas I think as you become a more advanced meditator, you're not contracting even on the focus of attention to such a degree. It's a much lighter hold. So because it's lighter, you can kind of catch the other stuff, the other phenomena that may be coming in, and you can do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only like a lighter grip, but maybe this is another type of attention, but the sort of the clarity, attentional clarity, where despite something being vague, you're like very assured. Yeah, I can see that in the murk in the distance. Like I know that's there. Like there's a certainty that develops through practice, and then with that certainty, even though something is starting as very vague, you can sort of start working on it and growing it, and sort of manually assigning more weight to it, or in some way. But at the same sense, still not being. Okay, so how do I reconcile this? Where you can kind of, there's a sense that you manually ascribe more intentionality towards directing attention to a particular object, and yet even this is where the insight of emptiness comes. Like despite this being the main show, whatever that mind object is, you're never like fully lost to the content of it. You can still see its hollowness. So what's going on there as the insight into emptiness develops?
I think it is that the precision weighting you're assigning to that object is never comparatively going so extremely high to the exclusion of everything else.
So, I mean, would like a really adept meditator, they just kind of never really assigning high precision weighting to anything unless it's like a real life or death situation? Is that
I think so. I mean, it's true that there are certain things like, if I slap you in the face right now, you're going to have trouble not assigning high precision to that, right?
Yeah.
Will Smith slap.
Yeah, I'm imagining it right now. I've got the predictive models, like imagining it come across, and I'm thinking, how would I react? And,
So, I mean, even an adept meditator, especially if they're not prepared, I mean, their body and their attention is usually going to spring into making something highly salient of certain types of things. I mean, you're just not going to assign a low precision weighting to, having suddenly finding there is a knife sticking out of your belly.
Right. Well, we have to run the experiment and see.
That'll be part 2 of this series.
Perhaps. I mean, you're the volunteer for this. But I mean, in some way, I think a lot of people wouldn't like the sound of that then, your world becomes less real in some sense. In some way, I mean, I can actually relate to that sentiment. There is this sort of sense of like, it's not what it used to be. I mean, the world is certainly not what it used to be for me. And in some way, it's less real in the way that before there was a really taken in by a framing that the world is like this really hard, concrete, physical static structure,
Hmm.
and now everything's much lighter and airier and moving and flowing. How can you how do you sell that to people that it's worth them sort of de-reifying their world
Yeah.
experience?
So this is like an interesting thing about the sense of realness. So yeah, there's one sense in which we really grip onto the realness of objects and the world that decreases as we meditate more, in part because again we're not like slamming all of our precision onto certain objects in attention. It's more like we're just holding more stuff and more lightly at once. But there's another way, I think, in which the world does become more real, which is in terms of, I think in Buddhism, you could refer to it as suchness, or like presence. So it's interesting because as you start contracting less around different phenomena, there's a sense in which the phenomena start becoming much more vibrant, much more present, much more alive, kind of in a sense. And you gain that rather than lose that through meditation. And that's kind of what people get on psychedelics. It's like when they feel really alive and like the world's just like, breathing with them or something. It's that type of thing. It's like when the leaves on the trees become amazing just to look at.
Right. Well, then how would you contrast psychedelic perception from meditative perception, predictive processing? I mean, is it still a downweighting of precision, and what's...
Yeah.
Because it's different. It's...
I think it's similar in the sense that it deconceptualizes out of the narrative mind. They both do that, and you're kind of more in the present moment. You're telling less stories to yourself, but
or it could be hyperactivated. Actually, you could be telling a lot more stories, and then this is where like very mystical, religious type fables spring out of those states of those psychedelic states of mind, and they're thoroughly convincing.
True. Yeah, I mean, I'm not, to be honest, an expert on kind of the psychedelic phenomena, but it's, in any case, I think they do they not tend to be different than the types of like thought patterns and narrative patterns the person normally has. Like, I think they tend to
you do a lot more lateral thinking and connecting the dots in ways that you wouldn't otherwise. But I think I mean, a core difference with psychedelics is they can generate a lot more content. There's a lot, that generative process can be really, really stimulated. Whereas in meditation, depends what you're doing. But one type of sort of meditation that we're particular advocates for is defabrication process. Those hierarchical generative models are being down-regulated, and so we're noticing less at finer grain detail, and perception is shutting down, and then you go to states where there's just the most basic elements of perception.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, it's like with meditation you can kind of control to a degree the defabrication, whereas with psychedelics you might end up in a highly defabricated state, but you might also end up in like a moment of highly contracted terror. It moves you in terms of fabrication with the world intensely, which can teach you a lot, but you can't necessarily control where that's going at a given time. You're sort of just subject to the whims of the experience itself in many ways. Although I think this is where, if you are a meditator who does psychedelics and you have some degree of awareness of stuff, skills like actually defabricating when on psychedelics are really going to help you keep away from the bad stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas otherwise, can't do that as well.
Oh, and then there was a question I wanted to ask you about. Psychedelics defabrication. I don't know. I've lost it. But well, maybe. I mean, I think the emptiness insight becomes more starkly available to the adept meditator because you are living at a less fabricated state overall altogether.
I think you lock that in.
Yeah, and then it's just like being able to scale down to those core defabricated states that just become so accessible. And I mean, in some way, okay, so on psychedelics you have this like, I mean, you can even visually see this. You look at a plant and you see it blooming and then contracting inwards and blooming, and like you see the life cycles of plants, and that is really just your perceptive models fabricating in front of you, in front of your face. And when you meditate, I guess it's less stark, there's less vibrancy, but you can kind of do this on a whim. Okay, this is what I wanted to ask you. You said you can control it more with meditation. What is then controlling?
Yeah.
And I took you talking about letting go. How do you explain that phenomenon?
Yeah, so
and what is the manual override there?
I think letting go is somewhat akin to an active, in a way it's a move that decreases precision on whatever is currently in attention.
But you it's like you learn to build a switch for that.
Yeah.
And there can be almost like a mental corollary of like, you can feel that like I can feel it in some way, like I'm flicking the let go switch, flicking the let go switch, flicking the let go switch. And then even at some point you automatize that like repeated like let go move. So instead of a sense that you've got to do this from more like a system 2, operating system, it starts doing it itself, and you just kind of let that run, and it just like let go.
Yeah, and I think that's the part that's interesting. Like phenomenologically, what it feels like is release. It feels like this is like in our meditation sessions, the example I always give is like something like when you're just like, you sit down on the toilet and you're like, and it's like, that's a moment when you're pretty much always releasing. In fact, I think it requires releasing.
You can do some pushing, I think,
Yeah, but somewhere in there's a moment of releasing, and and everybody knows what it is.
Yeah, there's some expansion and contraction going on there. I do actually think there's a story of some kind of enlightened Sadhguru who like
John types.
He got enlightened on the toilet. Like some moment of like pure expansion. I guess it did the trick.
Yeah, stay alert and pay attention when letting go on the toilet.
Yes.
But yeah, it's like, I think a lot. Really, what the skill that meditators learn that isn't just a temporary kind of state is this letting go. Or at least one of the skills. It's like this capacity for just stopping actually clenching in a way.
Yeah.
It's just, and also noticing when one is sort of tensing up around something. So it's like an experience, there's some sort of like gripping over here. So it's like, you let it go. And it's just, as you get better and as you kind of lock in kind of insights and you have perceptual shifts in your experience through a lot of meditation, how quickly you can let go and how quickly you can notice that there is some sort of tensing somewhere is much faster. And also you kind of teach, as you said, you kind of teach your brain, the brain just kind of figures out how to just kind of do it almost on autopilot for most stuff anyways.
Yeah. But it really is a process. You have to learn to relax, learn to let go. It's not as easy as it sounds. There's a lot of years of training really, and then also sifting through your experience to subtler and subtler like tensions that you're holding, and like contractions and and thought spaces and stuff that you have to first identify as oh, I'm holding on to that in some way, and then let go of it. What about cessation and the conclusion of this letting go process to cessation? Can you perhaps link that with predictive processing? I mean,
I think so.
I think it's early days, I guess. No one knows, but you've got some thoughts.
Yeah. So I think as you progressively let go of phenomena, you start moving down the kind of hierarchy, as you say in predictive processing, or of the brain has, and you start getting more and more deconceptualized experience, like really complex conceptualization starts to fall away, narrative starts to fall away, and then eventually like the sense of objects, like kind of the meaning they have even starts to fall away. And this is something you can kind of see if you run through the jhanas and you run from first to eighth jhana, you can see that more and more aspects of experience, and we've talked about it, are stripped away. And then you start to get to a point where space itself collapses, the sense of time collapses. And basically even the knowing collapses. And ultimately there's just nothing left there, because unless you're at least tense, unless there's some amount of tension somewhere in your experience, then there actually is no experience. And basically when you hit the point where there actually is no experience, which is only like a fraction of a second, then that's a cessation. And then after that you're going to pop back up to like a relatively low degree of fabrication afterwards, which I think is kind of what the afterglow, a lot of like the afterglow kind of post cessation is.
But the downward trend towards nothing, no experience is, I think, less steep, is a slower defabrication and decline than the uptick, and then when you refabricate after post cessation, it seems to be you pop back up at faster at a higher level than when you entered in.
Yeah, you do, but interestingly, I think you also have like less tendency to over fabrication. It's sort of like both of those, I guess.
Yeah, but then in predictive processing terms, what do you think is happening at cessation?
Yeah, that's a good question.
What might you hypothesize? Because in some way you still must be getting sensory input in through the senses. It's not like these sense faculties stop working.
You're not biologically dead.
Yeah, you're not biologically dead. But
if we assume that, and this is our understanding, that you cannot have experience without some degree of contraction, phenomenological contraction, and that you're not, in predictive processing terms, going to have experience without a prediction of something. We can maybe say something like, if there is no phenomenological contraction, there is also no prediction happening. I don't know how that relates to what's going on below kind of the conscious level.
Yeah.
But it does seem that to predict anything, at least that shows up in phenomenal experience, means to contract.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just not being predicted. But
there has to be a binding of information in order to represent anything, and that binding comes with a sense of contraction. And
I think so. Like, there's work that has to be done to fabricate experience, is kind of the sense. I mean, that from a phenomenological understanding, that's how it feels.
Yeah.
Whether that's actually the case or not, as far as the brain function goes, I don't know. But I mean, probably, because humans, when they have a sense of doing a lot of work, their body usually does tend to be doing a lot of work. It's actually important that that is well correlated between conscious experience and what's actually going on.
That would make sense. Yeah.
I think
yeah,
so.
Yeah.
My intuitions, at least, would say that.
Yeah. That would.
Yeah, that's the case.
Well, I think actually even, I mean, it plays out in sleep, at least. You know, you move less in sleep, and you don't have to drink, and you don't have this hunger unless you're really, really hungry. But also, when I'm on meditation retreat and I'm spending long hours not moving and spending time in lots of very defabricated states, there is this, like, the body can just sit there for hours and it's not calling me to drink or to eat or exert itself in these ways, actually.
Yeah.
So just hypothetically posing, I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done, but could it be that at cessation you've got there's a downplaying or a complete downplaying of top-down information processing, such that, okay, that just like stops rendering, or that the top-down information processing actually meets and matches for once in its life, it meets and matches the bottom-up information processing, and then they cancel each other out, and maybe then consciousness is rendered useless. This is a thought, because correct me if I'm wrong, but it's presumed that the majority of the time our conscious view of the world is that there's always some error. Like, we're always trying to minimize this error prediction, but there is always an error between our predictive models and then the incoming sensory data, and what we perceive of the world is always slightly, or to however much degree, off. Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of thing to think about. Like, if you think of the process as you're moving towards cessation in terms of you're moving down the predictive hierarchy, your experience is getting simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler, then what happens when you move all the way, like, as close as you can possibly move to the sensory stream? And if you release any more, then there's no prediction, because you can't predict beyond the rawest kind of representation of the sensory stream. But the thing is, it has to be happening at that place in the hierarchy. It has to be happening as low as you can possibly go, where there basically is the most minimal representation and then no representation. So the predicting and the comparing to what's coming in has to, I've never exactly thought of it this way before, but there has to be I think it's more like you're shutting down the system. It's just like the predictive, the prediction, there is just no prediction, so there's nothing to compare about. It can't cancel out. There is no more one side of the equation or something. And with that one side of the equation lost, conscious experience itself is also lost.
Okay. Okay.
Um,
So I was thinking
it's like the dance partner
right.
goes away.
I like yeah. I can't uphold the duality in some
Yeah.
sense. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So yeah, I mean, I would have thought maybe, I mean, the more parsimonious your yeah predictions are, the less you're predicting, the less there is to be wrong about, which minimizes the error. Well,
Yeah,
you could be very
which
wrong
makes sort
about
of,
even the minimal content, I suppose, temporally, and like that's where you're
yeah.
like, you know, you can have psychedelic experiences where there's not a lot going on, but
Mhm.
you're really off, out of sync of the predicting the next incoming wave of content,
Mm,
and it creates a really sort of uneasy experience. I mean, it can be
yeah.
tremendous negative valence in those experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because here it's sort of like the question of what is the relationship between effective valence and. Could you
Well,
say what you were saying again?
the less you're predicting,
Mm.
the less margin of error there
Oh
could
yeah.
be. It's sort of
Okay.
easier to predict less, consequently, but you could still be way off even in those like if you're trying to just count the number of beats per second to a simple one note
Mm.
song, you
Yeah.
could still be really off. You think, okay, it's coming now, and then it's beep. Oh, you just missed
Yeah.
it, and that so there's there being such a discrepancy in between your simple prediction of a simple matter, but it's like temporally quite a bit off,
Yeah.
really throws you and creates a lot of suffering. Actually.
Yeah. I think there's something there, and some of the predictive processing accounts of how affect work kind of they do it as if you feel that your predictions of reality are becoming worse and worse, then you're going to start feeling worse and worse. And if you feel that your
Mm.
predictions of reality are becoming better and better, then you're going to start feeling better. There's sort of like a resonance with how you're doing in the game of predicting
Mm,
reality.
mm, mm.
Um,
I'm
the
thinking of those real quick. I'm thinking of those like in the arcades, those dance games. We have to like step on
Yeah,
the arrows at the right time to like do the dance moves, and you feel like really on a roll. I guess it's like, you know, the points keep racking up. It's like yeah, and then if you stumble, it's like, oh, I got that wrong, and then you just
yeah.
cascade into getting loads of them wrong.
I think there's something like that. It's sort of like
Mm,
I think being in a flow state. Part of that is that you're getting everything better than expected, and it creates this like kind of awesome vibe of you're just everything you're nailing, um, you're predicting well.
You said better than expected. That's interesting because then you have a mismatch of your prediction of how you expect yourself to
Yeah,
do.
it's like
And
a
then that's often
meta.
what
It's a
throws you
meta
out.
thing.
That's what
Yeah,
throws you out of the flow state, right? You think, like, I shouldn't be this good. And then you start, oh, okay, I'm actually not so good anymore.
yeah.
Oh,
Hmm. Um,
sorry, you were going to start
well,
off.
I was just gonna say like there's an interesting question, and I mean I think this is something I'm actually gonna look at in my PhD, but there's an interesting question of what is the relationship between this type of valence, which does seem to be a part of experience, and valence in terms of like momentary valence in terms of contraction of different things.
Mm,
Um, and I mean, I don't actually know the answer to that right now, but somehow we need to account for both of those.
you mean the valence of, like, flow states, which are they can be very fabricated, and the valence of then just inherent contraction in all moments of experience, and then as we defabricate, we release more and more contraction. So we're comparing.
Yeah, like let's say you're in a highly defabricated state, but everything perception is predicting is wrong.
Yeah.
Or let's say you're in a flow state, or let's just say a state where you're predicting well or better than expected, let's say, over a course of time, but it's a situation where you are running from a bear. then sort of the question is like how can we think of that? And I don't actually know the answer yet, but I feel like this is where the phenomenology kind of from meditation, this understanding of kind of a sense of suffering or well-being being related to expansion and contraction is quite relevant. It has something to add there.
Well, I certainly think so.
but one in the corner.
I had this thought about meaning when you talk about the scenario of someone running away from a bear, and often these moments of the world is demanding a lot from you, and you have to really exist in this moment and really act. But those moments can seem the most meaningful moments. Like I really have a purpose. It's obvious what my purpose is. I need to get away from this bear. And there's no ifs or dats or philosophizing about it, thinking about it, doubting. You just do. You just act. And meaningful states of mind alleviate suffering.
Yeah.
And I wonder if meaning could come from, you've got a lot of predictions going on, but you're meeting them. You actually there's a lot of conceptualizing, fabricating going on, but you're actually meeting those predictions quite accurately, and they're maybe coming. Can the stream of predictions speed up and slow down? Is it?
I wouldn't know how to answer that, but
because meaning, because I think about I sort of think about Viktor Frankl's book Man's Search for Meaning. Last night even, I really liked that book, and that meaning is really important for a well-lived life. And in some sense, yes, but there's states of mind to get into where it's like meaning's just not even on the table. It's just not even in question. Like in these really absorbed meditative states, there's no meaning conceptualizing, and in fact that sense of doership is absent. But there the affect is sort of is very positive, and meaning has nothing to do with it. But
it strikes me here that there's something about there is something here about the certainty of what one is doing. So especially suffering in like a non-direct kind of pain sense, a lot of it I think is due to uncertainty about what's going to unfold and how you meet that as an agent in the world. And I think when you're running away from the bear, what you need to do, at least there will be moments when what you need to do is absolutely clear. Not all of them. You might need to decide, am I going to climb this tree or try to play dead?
Bears climb trees, and they're better at climbing trees than you. So, I mean, you're Canadian, you should know. In fact, you might have been in a situation like this.
It's best to have pepper spray.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You got, I think, 2 or 3 shots.
Yeah. Make
sure you hit the bear when it's charging you, or.
Oh really?
Yeah, I don't know. Good luck.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's sort of like the knowing with confidence what one needs to do feels good. And this uncertainty of a plethora of options and none of them seeming like the clear path forward is when it's something that your survival depends on. If it's just like what type of postage stamp to buy, that's super like retro example. But
some people buy postage stamps still.
Everyone will know what model of fruit bowl to buy. That's something people still use.
I think I buy postage stamps more often than I buy fruit bowls. It's funny you switched to that example.
Yeah, they're terrible examples.
Okay, we're going with the fruit bowl.
But in any case, some sort of decision making on something that's not life critical. Yeah. That's okay, fine. There's uncertainty there, and actually that uncertainty is often unenjoyable, which is why you get the whole business person. I'm just gonna wear Mark Zuckerberg that wears the same clothes every day, or Steve Jobs, or these people that they're like, I'm just gonna remove any having to decide about my wardrobe out of the equation.
Yeah.
Because it uses energy, mental energy, and it kind of is annoying for depending on what you're trying to do. But I think when there are survival situations and you have deep uncertainty about what you're going to do, that's kind of the worst situation you can be in a way.
There's a lot of heavy precision weighting, because it's actually perhaps an absence of determined selection, where you've got many options and you don't know, and maybe a lot of them are being heavily determined as like very salient, real possibilities. Yeah. And that kind of decision making on openness, on unknowing is disconcerting and not enjoyable.
Yeah. And I think can induce some type of paralysis even.
Yeah.
So you get none of the possibilities can win out.
Yeah.
And so it's like, what do you do? It's like the bear is coming to eat me. I can't decide, what's the move? I don't know. So yeah, there's something about the knowing the clear path forward, even in a hazardous situation, that is clearly better than not knowing the path forward. But that doesn't mean that you're in a highly valent state while you're, running away as fast as you can from the bear. So it's sort of like, somehow these things all need to be kind of included in the equation. And
but on this knowing the way forward thing, there's a way in which when you become aware of the mechanisms of qualia at fine grain resolution details, and then notice that those, such as like expansion and contraction, those are mechanisms that do scale up as well, and you can attune to them at the least fabricated states and at the highest, and notice them there. And I think of in the Tao Te Ching, there's once you know the way, you see it in all things. And I really relate that to expansion and contraction. Once you get this, you see it in all things. And then even, existing sort of very mundane states of mind where you're walking about buying fruit bowls and stuff, you can tune into expansion and contraction. Within a conversation, there are pressures and releases and ebbs and flows, and there can be, if you can kind of predict the oscillations there, you can ride those waves. You can surf them, as Andy Clark would say.
Yeah.
Maybe just to round up, if you were going to pick a state of mind that's very meaningful and fabricated, or flowy, and you know what you're doing, or a very defabricated state of mind there's no sense of meaning or purpose in that state of mind, which do you think is more preferable?
It's a great question. I think that the mind wants to choose the first one, but the second one is the one that actually makes you at peace with death.
I like that answer. Do you want to elaborate more, or should we let people interpret that how they like?
I think we should leave it here, even cut it before they elaborate more.
Yeah, there you go, people. Hope you enjoyed this chat.
Thank you.